you would go ahead and be turning to Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13, that's where we're going to be in our Bible study here this morning. Before we get into chapter 13, just a couple of things I want to note. Really mostly just one. Chapter 14's outline and questions are on the back table. If you want to pick that up as you leave. 13 is a rather lengthy chapter, so probably we'll be getting to 14 on next Sunday, and we'll be doing 13 today and on Wednesday. But in case we get through 13 or get started on 14 at least somewhat, chapter 14 is on the back table, or you can go ahead and pick it up and have it for next week. So you can go ahead and pick that up. In our study of the Gospel of Matthew, we've been pointing out that Matthew is arguing that Jesus is the Messiah of the Old Testament and Old Testament prophecy. Time and time again, he uses the phrase that it might be fulfilled. Either Jesus having said it, or a lot of times it is stated by Matthew that this is happening as a reference to this prophecy. So Matthew argues heavily from Old Testament prophecy that Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy. Now, the outline we're following is Faith Life Study Bible's outline. It's 3 points. We've got the prelude to Jesus' ministry in 1:1 to 4:16, the ministry in Galilee 4:17 to 16:20, and Jesus in Jerusalem 16:21 to 28:20. Again, you may find some difference in divisions on that second point on Galilee. As we look here, they have the Great Galilean ministry going through 14:12. Some have it going through 18, depending on whether you combine some things, because he spends a lot of his time in Galilee. But we're following this one for simplicity's sake. Some have 10-point outlines, some have 5-point outlines, and you can. When I originally outlined Matthew 13 several years ago, I was going back through re-outlining it this last time. My outline of the chapter of Matthew 13 was like some of the people's of the book. It was like 10 points, this parable. So we organize it and try to condense it down. So the divisions may be a little bit different than this, but this gives us a good overview of what we're dealing with in the book. Our chapter content, I'm not going to go through every one of them. We've added a lot of chapters, so we'll go over our new one after we finish a chapter. So whatever we went over last, but we won't go over these every time. We'll go over them again at some point, one through them, but it will take us a long time to go through them in all detail. Chapter 1, genealogy, birth of the Messiah. 2, the Messiah as a child. 3, the forerunner of the Messiah. 4, the Messiah's temptation, early ministry. 5 through 7, Messiah preaches Sermon on the Mount. 8, the Messiah performs miracles. 9, he performs more miracles. 10 is the call to the 12. Messiah calls the 12 apostles in the limited commission. 11, messengers from John are sent to the Messiah. We've added one new chapter since then. What was chapter 12 about? Pharisees find fault with the Messiah. So this is where the Pharisees are coming in and saying, hey, here's the faults they find. He violates the Sabbath. He casts out demons by Beelzebub, and a number of things they accuse him of. We're ready for Matthew chapter 13. Matthew 13, the Messiah tells many parables. Jesus often taught in parables. There are a number of passages recording parables, but Matthew 13 records a great number of those here for us. I have these out of order, so we'll go to this one first. Question 1, briefly summarize the chapter. What is this chapter about?
The Messiah tells many parables.
Many parables. 3 things. He tells parables. He
explains parables.
Explains parables and explains why he uses parables. And then the final thing in the chapter, he's rejected at Nazareth. So this outline of the chapter, by the way, it's different than normal. If you realize looking at your outline that point 1 actually starts in verse 10, point 2 goes back to verse 1. In my Bible, I have it outlined different. I actually flip 1 and 2. I have this as point 1 in my Bible, writing it down, and this is point 2. First of all, it would feel awkward doing it in reverse in there. The reason I have them flipped for our study here is the vast majority is focused on parables, but Jesus tells one parable, then explains the purpose of parables, then goes into explaining his parables and telling more. So we're going to start with the purpose of parables because we're grouping all the parables together. Again, why do we do that? Because it makes it simpler. Otherwise, we might have a 15-point outline. Here's the parable of the sower, point 1. Point 2, he explains parables. Point 3, he explains the parable of the sower. Point 4, and so we combine these for simplicity's sake. So again, in my Bible, I actually have them flipped, but we're starting with purpose of parables because that's where we're going to go first in talking about this text to see why he spoke in parables before we go through all the parables of chapter 13. What's the key verse of the chapter? 34 and 35, all these things Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to them, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things kept secret from the foundation of the world. Question number 3, list Old Testament passages quoted or referenced in this chapter. There's 2. Verses 14 and 15 are a quotation of Isaiah 6, 9, and 10. He said, go and tell this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and return and be healed. The second one's verse 35, which we just saw as one of our key verses. I will utter these things. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things kept secret from the foundation of the world. That's Matthew's account. That's quoting Psalm 78:2. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old is how it's translated from Hebrew. Again, translations may be a little different when we're reading a quotation in the New Testament, because when we're reading from the Old Testament passage like Psalm 78:2, we are reading from the Hebrew translated to English. They are quoting not from the Hebrew, but from the Septuagint. So it's already gone from Hebrew to Greek, and then it's translated from Greek to English, where we read it in the New Testament. So there may be a little bit of variation in translation. Let's go to point number 1, verses 10 to 17 and 34 to 35. Again, not normally how we would outline a text, but we want to get the purpose of parables before we go through all the parables, because again, Jesus explains the purpose of parables just 10 verses in, and the parables cover 40-something verses. And so we're going to go ahead and grab the purpose of parables, and then we'll go back through each of these parables. After Jesus told the first parable, the parable of the sower, 1 to 9, the disciples came, verse 10, and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? So the disciples here are curious. Why is it you would speak to the people using all of these parables? It's how, he speaks to them using these different terms. A parable, by the way, just means a placing of one thing by the side of another. He would take a practical lesson, something we need to know in our life, and he would use a story of something they would know to illustrate the point. And so some parables may be different, would feel different to today's society. If he was using today's society, he might use a different analogy, but he's using something they would understand and paralleling it to the kingdom. And so the disciples are saying, why is it you're speaking in these parables? They come and ask him because he's been telling parables before. He just told another one. We get later in the text, he's going to tell a whole lot more. Why is it they want to know that you're speaking in these parables? Yes.
About Nathan the prophet, when he came to David, he didn't run out and say, hey, you're guilty of all these things, Bathsheba, Uriah, and everything. But he essentially, for all practical purposes, used a parable, and it was more effective that way. David didn't have a chance to build up any walls, so he didn't run out and told him. So he, by his own speech, he condemned himself. So that just kind of comes to mind. This is not a totally new concept.
You're right. That's a good point. That's what Nathan really did in David with that story there. He took a practical, a realistic, real-world scenario and paralleled it to a lesson that needed to be learned. That's what Jesus is doing here. Jesus answered and said to them, verse 11, because it will be given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them has not been given. I'm going to pause there for a second. We've got 2 key phrases in the book of Matthew. What are they? That it might be fulfilled, and the other is the kingdom of heaven. This is 13th of 32 occurrences of the kingdom of heaven. If you're noting those in your Bible, we haven't been noting all those throughout. I'm going to try to remember to note those from here on out to remind us. This is 13 of 32. If you want to go back and get others that you may have missed, highlight them. I've got them highlighted and written out what number it is. There's still some sheets on the back that has a list of all the references of kingdom of heaven, of the kingdom of heaven on it. So he says, it'll be given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because they seeing do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull, their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their heart and turn, so that I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it. So here's the point Jesus is making. When he speaks in parables, those that are willing to listen and understand are going to understand. So let's just take here this chapter where he speaks in a variety of parables. Those that understand are going to get an overview, and I've got this question later on, but I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead of myself for a minute so we can get the point. There are a number of parables in this chapter: the sower, the wheat and the tares, the mustard seed, leaven, hidden treasure, pearl of great price, the dragnet, and the household. There's 8 parables here in these chapters. Now, some of them make similar points. So again, I'm going to jump ahead to question 6. The parable of the sower's meaning. The parable of the sower, some are going to have receptive hearts, some don't. By the way, he just told that parable, which made that point. He then explains it following this text. The wheat and the tares and the dragnet both have to do with the separation of those that are righteous and unrighteous. The value of the kingdom in the hidden treasure and the pearl of great price. The mustard seed and leaven, the influence of the kingdom. The householder helps talk about one that harmonizes the Old and the New Testament concerning the kingdom. That's what he's talking about there. We'll talk about those as we get to them in more detail. Here's my point. Those willing to listen, when Jesus talks about the sower, are going to understand he's talking about our reception of the message. When he talks about the mustard seed, when he talks about the leaven, he's going to talk about their influence. When he talks about the treasure, the pearl of great price, he's talking about the value of being part of this kingdom. But for those that don't understand, this week he's talking about gardening. Next time he's talking about planting mustard seeds. Now he's talking about baking bread. And then he's talking about somebody going fishing with a dragnet. And now he's talking about going on a treasure hunt. And to the people that are not paying attention, it may just seem like he's jumping all over the place with a bunch of stories. But to those willing to be receptive to the message, they're going to understand what he's saying. So the purpose of parables, question number 4, why did Jesus say he spoke in parables?
Wouldn't be able to use the point that the parable's making in a meaningful way in their everyday life.
They'd be able to use it in a meaningful way. Why else did he say he spoke in parables? It reveals to the open heart. It conceals from the heart from the heart of the one that's not going to listen. Jesus might come out and he still probably wouldn't have had much reception, but if Jesus had come out and just flat out said some of the statements, he may have gained more enemies quicker. People may have been less receptive. People may have been more receptive, but only because of wrong attitudes, not because they really had an open heart, just because that kind of sounds good. The parables is really laying aside what kind of heart the people have. Are they willing to listen and understand? Let's go to verse 34 and 35. This is in the middle of the parables again, but he briefly mentions again why he spoke in parables, or briefly mentions again why he spoke in parables. All these things Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to them, that it might be fulfilled. There's 8 of 11, our other phrase, that it might be fulfilled. This is 8 of 11. Again, if you're counting different, you'll have to do the math yourself as to which occurrences. I think it's, if you're not counting some of the other ones, but if you're counting all 11 occurrences, which are in the majority text, and all 11 occurrences, including the one that doesn't have a direct quotation with it, this is number 8 of 11, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things kept secret from the foundation of the world. Psalm 78:2, as we already mentioned. So the second purpose of parables, the first purpose was it revealed to those willing to listen, while concealing from those who were not going to be willing to be receptive to the message. Second reason Jesus spoke in parables, that it would fulfill Old Testament prophecy. It was prophesied he would speak in parables. By speaking to them only in parables, Matthew says it fulfills Old Testament prophecy. We've already touched on these briefly, so we'll go ahead and jump ahead to this. The parables that Jesus told. Now, this is the vast majority of the chapter. We've got 8 of them. We've got the parable of the sower in 1 to 9 and 18 to 23. He tells it in 1 to 9. He explains it in 18 to 23. The parable of the wheat and tares, 24 to 30 and 36 to 43. He tells it 24 to 30. He explains it 36 to 43. Let's go ahead and get the point of these parables. On the same day, that is where we ended off in Matthew 12, when Jesus' mother and brothers came to him, and he said, "Who's my mother, my brother?" On that same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. A great multitude were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. And he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, "Behold, a sower went out to sow, and he sowed some seed. And as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on the stony places where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." We're going to explain this parable in a minute, or rather, we're going to let the Lord explain this parable in a minute as he explains it in 18 to 23. But I do want to focus on one practical lesson from verse 18, or verse 8, rather. Some yielded 100, some 60-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. Yet those that fell on the good ground that yielded, as long as they yielded, they were going to be pleasing. It was expected of one what they are capable of doing. God doesn't expect every man to lead singing. God doesn't expect every man to be a preacher. He expects them to meet the role they can meet. He doesn't expect everybody. Some people may be better at encouraging. Some people may be better at teaching Bible classes. Some people have different talents. God expects of us what we have the ability to do. I learned that practically from this section. Going to verse 18 now, where Jesus explains the parable. He says, "Therefore hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches it away. That was what was sown in his heart. This is he who received the seed by the wayside." So the wayside's the one they hear the word, but they're hard-hearted enough that's it's just snatched away instantly. It has no effect. He who received the seed on the stony places is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. So this is the one that accepts the gospel message. But I think if you think about it in Luke 14's terms, they haven't really counted the cost. They've made the decision. They've heard they need to hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. They do that. They don't fully understand what they're doing. So now as soon as something arises of difficulty, there's no deep-rooted faith. They haven't grown in their faith. Because it's not rooted, they immediately fall away. Verse 22, the one that receives the thorn among the thorns is the one that hears the word, but then the deceitfulness of riches choke out the word. The cares of this world choke out the word, and it becomes unfruitful. They hear it. There is a root, but the thorns, the things of this life, choke it out. Finally, the good ground, the one that hears it, accepts it, and then produces fruit. That's the one with the receptive heart that continues serving faithfully. Yes.
Paul said, "Yea, and all that desire to live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." So somebody may hear some of the word of God, and they may not even know that's part of this, of faith in Christ. But that's where older Christians need to be preemptive and head this off, because it is going to come. You know, sometimes new Christians are more apt to profess their newfound faith than somebody that's older. And then what are you going to do? Well, as a result of that, you're going to be ostracized perhaps, or talked about or whatever. So, you know, it's not may, they shall. So it's like the more you can do to help solidify the faith, not only of faith in Christ, everybody, that's going to help, so that this person doesn't become that and actually ends up in the full soil.
You're right, you know, and as you think about that again, the analogy of among the stones and the persecution, perhaps you can call to mind those that when they were babes in Christ, as you mentioned, they're those that they were on fire for the Lord. At least they seemed to be. They came out like their hair was on fire, and they were going to tell everybody. And then it seems like it's not that long at all before they've gone from on fire to the Lord to complete cold and rejecting it, because there was, again, no root. So when any difficulty arises, they then give up, because they don't understand that cost to grow, and they don't understand that need for a deep-rooted faith. Let's go to verse 24 now. The second parable of the chapter is the wheat and the tares. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven, again, if you're highlighting, that's 14 of 32. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servant of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? He said to them, An enemy has done this. The servant said to him, Do you want us to go and gather them up? But he said, No, lest you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Now, just quickly before we get to the explanation of this text, and again, this is one of those that Jesus gives us the explanation, breaking it down in a minute. My understanding is that tares, these types of weeds, would resemble very closely to wheat as they began to grow. So if you're going to tear it up in the early stages, you're not going to know what's the wheat and what's the tares. What's the wheat and what's a weed? Which one is it? You wouldn't know. So what's the best thing to do? Just let them grow together, and then when they're grown, you're going to be able to differentiate between the two. Now, let me real quick deal with a misconception or misuse and abuse of this text, because when we get to the explanation of the text, Jesus is going to answer that himself. Some have tried to use this to argue against the church practicing church discipline, to argue that you let the wheat and the tares grow up together, and the Lord is going to weed them out in the harvest and cast them aside. So as we interpret the text, we're going to go read the explanation in the text. I want to draw your attention to one specific word. I'll read it, and then I'll come back to this word in a minute. But Jesus sent to the multitude, verse 36 beginning, away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the wheat, or the parable of the tares of the field. He answered and said to them, He who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. It's another term for Christ. The field is the world, the good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered together and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and those who practice lawlessness, and cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be weeping or wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So let's get the point, and then I'll come back to answering that specific question. The overview of the point is this. You've got those of the kingdom, that's those that are the wheat. You've got those of the tares, that's those he describes of the world. More about that in a minute. At the end of time, there's going to be separation of those two. When the Lord returns and he sends out, and he says, the angels are sent out to gather those that offend, those that do things that are lawless, they're cast out where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth. That's eternal condemnation. Those that are the wheat, those that are part of the kingdom, come in then, and the righteousness will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. They will be with him in heaven. That's the point of the text, the separation of righteous and unrighteous in judgment. Those of the kingdom separate from those of the world. But that's an important distinction. Look back at verse 8. The field is what? The world. Verse 38. Look again, verse 38. Verse 37 beginning, He who sows the good seeds, the Son of Man, the field is the world. So what do we say the misconception is? Some argue that we can't practice what? Church discipline, because it says that the Lord's going to have them separated at the end of time. He's not talking about the church. He does talk about the church in Matthew at times. That's chapter 16. That's chapter 18. Right here, he talks about those of the world. The field is the world, not the church. So what he's talking about again is at the end of time, there's a separation of those that are righteous from those that are unrighteous. He's not saying that you shouldn't practice discipline. In fact, that would be contrary to what he says in chapter 18 later on in a text where he does, by the way, mention the church. So, some have tried to use this and argue the field, verse 38, is the world. Now, we got to backtrack a little bit, back to verse 31 now, because again, I know we're doing some jumping around a little bit here, but he'll tell a parable, and then later on, after he tells several, the apostles or the disciples come to him and say, can you explain it to us? Instead of coming back to the same parable again, we're just getting that all at once. So let's go back to 31 and 32 and 33. This is all we have time for here this morning, but I want to get these two together. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven, that's 15 to 32. There's occurrence 15 of 32 of the kingdom of heaven, is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is greater than the herbs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. Next parable, verse 33, the parable 11. Another parable he spoke to them, the kingdom of heaven. There's 16 of 32. We're halfway through our occurrences now. We'll come to it several more times in this text. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid it under 3 measures of meal till it was all leavened. So what do these two things have in common? Well, a mustard seed is the smallest of the seeds, but it grows into a big tree. Leaven, you just need a little bit of leaven. Remember, Paul uses this analogy when talking about discipline. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Here's the point. The kingdom may seem small, but its influence and its growth is going to be what? Great and rapid. It's like that tiny seed that grows into the large tree. That's the growth of the kingdom. By the time Acts ends, all of that area, remember, was it Jerusalem or Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, the gospel had gone out in the book of Acts. Yes.
About what Gamaliel said, if this be of God, we can't fight against it. But 2,000 years ago, the kingdom still exists today. You know what I mean? He did make a wise statement here. Gamaliel did. And I think about that in light of what we're reading here.
You're right. And that small seed that grew into that big tree, you can't fight against it. I also learned this, by the way, and quickly by way of application as our time runs out this morning. Sometimes people look at what can we do in helping the Lord's church grow, and it's something smaller. It seems insignificant. The mustard seed, the small seed, grows into a big tree. What little influence we have can grow a long way. There's a song in the supplemental book. We haven't sung it here before, but it's called The Apples in a Seed. And the point of the song is, if you cut open an apple, there's seeds in it, and you can count how many seeds are in an apple. You can look at an apple tree, and you can count how many apples are on a tree, but you know what you can't count? How many apples result from one seed. You plant one seed, apple tree grows. Plant your seed, tree grows, apples grow on it. Guess what's in those apples? More seeds. Plant those seeds, more trees grow. So on and so forth. Tiny influence, the mustard seed here, as Jesus is using the leaven, little bit, but it would grow. It may seem small, but the kingdom will grow. Its influence will grow. And we already saw back in chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount of the influence of the kingdom. Lord willing, we'll pick up here in chapter 13 again on Wednesday evening. Go ahead and pick up chapter 14. We may finish 13 and get into 14. We've got, 4 parables left, and then Jesus' rejection. So go ahead and pick up 14 in case we get there on Wednesday evening.